For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations.
He said, well, we've learned that there's a new art in the practice of democracy, the art of what he called manufacturing consent. Bernays' term was engineering of consent. And this is very significant because the public should not be participants in the democratic process. They should be spectators, not participants. They are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, as he put it. And for their own benefit, we, the intelligent minority, the responsible men, must control them.
We are going to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, because whilst others might free the body, none but ourselves can free the mind. Marcus Garvey. For the physical and financial states of control we now face to have been attained, first, a system of mental bondage would have had to have been implemented. This is the strongest type of control because it is the foundation of all other systems of control. The reasoning behind this is because it is impossible to control a conscious and educated mind. Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Richard Hofstadter stated in his book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, there is a cult of ignorance in the United States, and there always has been. The strain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, neutered by the false notion that democracy means my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. The depth of this statement can be seen throughout U.S. history, from the deliberate illiteracy of African slaves or the mass re-education of Native Americans. In both cases, native languages, writing, and spiritual practices were forbidden by law. This psychological tactic was meant to separate the natives and the Africans from their history and replace critical and cultural thinking with assimilation and coercion. Yet these psychological tactics have no racial boundaries, only levels of understanding. For governments and corporations to maintain power, they would have to manipulate and maintain the intellectual understanding of all of the people in the U.S. One cannot wage war under the present conditions without the support of public opinion, which is tremendously molded by the press and other forms of propaganda. Douglas MacArthur. The first major war propaganda campaigns in the U.S. took place during World Wars I and II. A few things to think about as far as World War I. At the time, the United States was at the doorstep of the Roaring '20s, as we spoke about in Part 3. The population of the U.S. was greatly against involvement because at the time, a large part of their wealth was coming from arms and textile sales to both sides fighting in World War I. Meanwhile, in England, Winston Churchill orders a study on the probability of the U.S. entering World War I if a passenger ship with Americans on board is sunk by a German U-boat, setting the stage for the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. The Lusitania, a British ocean liner en route from New York to Liverpool with 1,900 passengers on board, including 120 U.S. citizens. Unbeknownst to them or the U.S. population, it was also smuggling arms, so much that the U-boat torpedo did not sink the ship. It merely set off the explosives being smuggled. The ship would later be mined by the British to destroy the evidence of the munition. This event would spark the propaganda campaign that would bring us into World War I. We see the same tactic to bring the U.S. into World War II, yet this time on a far larger scale, in the bombing of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. After being dragged into World War I, the masses of the U.S. wanted nothing to do with any foreign wars, and once again the American economy was being fed by sales to all sides of the conflict. Prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was publicly against the U.S. entry, was privately issuing orders to the Red Cross to secretly send medical supplies in advance of the attack. The final nails in the coffin of FDR knowing about the attack came with the release of information concerning the U.S. Signal Intelligence Corps cracking the Purple Code, the encryption system used by Japanese diplomats, and also the Japanese Navy, revealing the plans on the attack on almost the same-day basis. Furthermore, FDR had been warned by a U.S. German double agent and 2 naval admirals, to whom he replied, "Leave the information with me and do not discuss it with anyone." After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. propaganda machine fired up again, culminating in the dropping of the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Once again, we see the same tactics at play: false flag or a deliberate military stand down in the face of a known engagement, followed by a propaganda campaign to sway the public opinion in the direction of war. This system is played out in almost every U.S. military conflict, from the Gulf of Tonkin incident that falsely sparked the Vietnam War to the attacks of September 11th, which laid the framework for all the wars that the U.S. is now currently in, and also the Patriot Act, the Patriot Act II, the Office of Homeland Security, and a plethora of rights and freedoms being slain in the guise of the War on Terror. To delve deeper into the grasp propaganda and psychological warfare have in the U.S., let us take a look at Edward Bernays' book, Propaganda. Propaganda, a book published in 1928, written by Edward Bernays, can be summed up by its first 2 sentences. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. This statement is alarming, to say the least, but when you put it into context of how our society functions, you can easily see that he was not referring to an element of democracy, he was talking about how to control it. This book serves as a blueprint to the corporatocracy we now live under. Bernays exploited the outcomes and the tactics used in this book with his Torches of Freedom campaign, geared towards encouraging women to start smoking in public. In 1928, George Washington Hill, the president of the American Tobacco Company, wanted to expand marketing to women. He said it would be like opening a gold mine right here in our front yard. Hill hired Bernays to create a campaign that would release the social taboo of women smoking in public, which would in turn open the door for marketing to women on a large scale. Bernays then hired a group of debutantes to march in the highly publicized Easter Day Parade in 1929. Bernays then hired professional photographers, and at a certain point, all of the women would light their cigarettes while holding banners saying "Torches of Freedom," in reference to the torch of the Statue of Liberty. The pictures from the march went global, and in one day, this psychological tactic changed the way women felt about smoking globally. This experiment fermented an ideology that is now part of our culture. Marketing became mental manipulation. An indirect method of steering public opinion was born. But the true sinister face of his methods would be seen in his actions preceding the CIA-backed coup of Guatemalan democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman in 1954. Arbenz, a former military officer and Minister of Defense under Juan José Arevalo, who was in the process of reforming labor laws. Arbenz would contest elections in 1950 and ended up winning by a margin of over 50%. He would continue the reformist policies of his predecessor, and at the centerpiece of his policy was a law granting cultivable land to peasants. The land was owned but not being used by the United Fruit Company, now Chiquita. United Fruit Company then hired Bernays to advise on how to overthrow President Arbenz. Due to the popularity of Arbenz and his policies in Guatemala, Bernays stated, as opposed to overthrowing the government, they should lobby Washington to do it for them. Bernays then hired a group of reporters to go to Guatemala to speak to political figures opposing Arbenz. The plan was to falsely prove connections between Arbenz and communism, and also to Russia, the USSR at that time, which was in the Cold War with the United States. His tactic worked in convincing Dwight D. Eisenhower, who then tasked the CIA to oversee the coup against Arbenz. The coup, codenamed Operation PB Success, resulted in 2 military governments, 36 years of brutal repression that saw the deaths and disappearances of over 200,000 Guatemalan civilians. A formal apology was given in 2011 from the Guatemalan government to Juan Jacobo Arbenz, the son of the deposed president. As I said earlier, Edward Bernays' book, Propaganda, is a blueprint. It is a step-by-step guide on how to rule a democracy by manipulation of the population. His footprints are evident every time you turn on the TV or every time you have to remove your shoes in an airport. During Bernays' career, he worked for the U.S. government and almost every major corporation, all starting with his work in the Creel Commission, the think tank that designed the propaganda campaign that sparked the United States' involvement in World War I, and is responsible for the deaths of over 117,000 American soldiers and civilians. Bernays constantly spoke of an invisible government, and he spent his life not only proving it, but streamlining its ability to function. So at this point, there is only one question: what are you going to do about it?